Karl Haushofer was born in Munich, Bavaria, on the 27th of August, 1869. He was a passionate German nationalist and became a career soldier and an artillery officer. His brilliance and attention to detail quickly led to his appointment to the German General Staff. In October 1908, however, something happened to change Haushofer's life and the history of the 20th century. The German army sent Haushofer to Tokyo to study the Japanese military. The assignment marked the beginning of a love affair with the Orient. Haushofer traveled extensively in the Far East, adding Korean, Japanese, and Chinese to his already extensive repertoire of Russian, French, and English languages. In Japan, Haushofer made the personal acquaintance of the emperor and began to develop a strong interest in militaristic and nationalistic Japanese culture. In 1914, when war broke out, Haushofer returned to Germany to fight on the Western Front. A brilliant soldier, he rose to the rank of Major General. But Germany was to be defeated in the Great War. And after World War I, the Versailles Treaty imposed a savage peace on Germany.
It must be remembered that the victorious Allies blamed Germany for the war. The peace that the Allies imposed was savage. German overseas territories were taken away. The army was restricted to 100,000 men. There was no air force. And the reparations imposed on Germany practically brought the economy to its knees.
The British now controlled Africa, India, and the Middle East. The United States dominated South America and the Pacific. Between them, the Anglo-Saxon sea powers controlled the world's oil and trade routes. Germany and the Eurasian landmass were isolated. Karl Haushofer retired from the army a bitter man. Like many other officers, he felt Germany had been defeated not only by the British and the Americans, but by the betrayal of communists and Jews. While fellow soldiers like Hitler were unemployed and penniless, Haushofer's Japanese experience got him an appointment as professor of geopolitics at Munich University in 1919. It was here that he began to plot the rebirth of Germany's military might. He formulated a political doctrine called Lebensraum, or living space, which asserted Germany's right to conquer and exploit the lands of her neighbors.
This doctrine was based on Haushofer's view of race and history, both of which he believed were on Germany's side. The enemies? These were the naval powers, the United States and Britain. What Haushofer wanted to create was an alliance across the Eurasian landmass, uniting Germany with Russia and Japan to build up a powerful enough group to stand up to the Anglo-Saxon sea powers.
In the 1920s, in the years following the First World War, Haushofer's great Eurasian alliance begins to take shape. Banned by the Versailles Treaty from having an air force or tanks, Germany signs a secret treaty with the Soviet Union. Called the Apollo Pact, it allows Germany to secretly train its soldiers and airmen in communist Russia, away from the prying eyes of the British and French. German aircraft designers, forbidden by the Versailles Treaty from building warplanes at home, are sent clandestinely to produce aircraft for the Japanese. Aircraft of these designs will eventually bomb Pearl Harbor. Germany in the 1920s, however, remained divided and without a leader. Karl Haushofer needed to find someone who could put his idea of Lebensraum into action. He found that person through a chance encounter with one of his students at Munich University, Rudolf Hess.
Hess had acted as Haushofer's adjutant during World War I, and he followed Haushofer to Munich, where he was lecturing. Now, Hess had been born in Alexandria, Egypt. His father was a merchant there. Hess was young and impressionable, and he was excited by the ideas that Haushofer had of bringing together the scattered German people.
Hess was already a member of the fledgling Nazi Party. Its leader was Adolf Hitler. In 1923, Hitler and his small band of Nazis tried to stage a coup in Bavaria. They were easily routed. Hitler and Rudolf Hess were arrested and imprisoned in the notorious Landsberg fortress. In Landsberg, Hitler started to write his blueprint for Nazi world domination. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle. But who really wrote Mein Kampf? Imprisoned in the Landsberg fortress, Hitler and Hess received a frequent visitor, Dr. Karl Haushofer.
When Hess was participating in the Beerholt Putsch, he took hostages, and after the failure of the putsch, he released the hostages, but he was then hid by Professor Karl Haushofer in his Munich flat, and he then escaped. He rejoined Hitler in Landsberg prison, where he became Hitler's secretary and took down Mein Kampf. While he was in Landsberg prison, which was a relatively gentle prison, as prisons go, he was visited by General Professor Karl Haushofer, and through Hess, Karl Haushofer was introduced to Hitler, and Hitler was interested in his ideas on geopolitics and the case for more Lebensraum. And through Hess, some of Karl Haushofer's ideas were transmitted into Mein Kampf.
It is even possible Haushofer wrote or edited parts of the book. Mein Kampf became a bestseller and transformed Hitler from a street fighter into a serious politician with mass support. As the Nazi Party's fortunes grew, so did those of Haushofer and Hess. When Hess married, 2 witnesses signed the marriage register, Adolf Hitler and Karl Haushofer.
Haushofer became the respectable face, the intellectual face of Nazism during the 20s and 30s. Hitler relied very heavily on his international contacts. Ribbentrop at the foreign ministry relied very heavily on his diplomatic knowledge. And also Albrecht, Haushofer's son, became second in command at the German Foreign Office.
Albrecht Haushofer was one of the most brilliant men ever to serve the Nazis. But unlike his father, he would quickly come to recognize the evil and brutal intent behind their ideology.
Albrecht Haushofer was a key special advisor and their expert on Britain. He was regarded by many of them as an Anglophile because he very much liked Britain. And indeed, earlier on, he had the dilemma as to whether he should emigrate to Britain when the Nazis came to power. But he did not wish to imperil his half-Jewish mother. So he supped with the devil, but in supping with the devil you need a long spoon, and Albrecht's spoon was not long enough.
In January 1937, Hitler announced he was rejecting the provisions of the Versailles Treaty. And in March 1938, he invaded Austria and made it a province of the Third Reich. Most German-speaking Austrians welcomed Hitler with open arms. But his entry into Austria had been prepared in secret. A special Nazi body called the Association for Germans Abroad was set up to organize Germans outside the Reich. The association pretended to be an international cultural agency linking Germans scattered abroad. Instead, in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other countries in Eastern Europe, it acted as a Nazi fifth column, recruiting agents, fomenting unrest, and demanding reunification with the fatherland. the Association for Germans Abroad was also active in America. Its president and key leader was none other than Professor Karl Haushofer. In 1938, Haushofer's Association for Germans Abroad organized unrest in the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. Hitler used this as a pretext to demand their return to the fatherland. The British and French gave in to these demands, and democratic Czechoslovakia was seized by the Nazis.
The betrayal of Czechoslovakia by the British and the French is one of the most shameful events in modern European history. The Czechs weren't consulted, and the very appeasement of Hitler, which was designed to hold off the war that everyone dreaded, did exactly the opposite. Hitler now thought the Western democracies, the French and the British, were pushovers, that they would fold whenever he made a demand. He believed from now on he could get away with murder.
Karl Haushofer's ideas were a useful smokescreen which obscured the real purpose of Nazi aims. The Nazi aims were extremely aggressive, which were to have a series of small wars succeeded by a much bigger war against Russia. And, of course, Karl Haushofer's teaching in favor of Lebensraum and geopolitics, geographical imperialism and expanding frontiers was, of course, a useful smokescreen which obscured their real ambitions.
It seemed only a matter of time before the Nazi drive for Lebensraum would engulf the globe in a new world war. In August 1939, Nazi Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and his deputy Albrecht Haushofer come a step closer to creating the great Pan-Eurasian alliance against the British and Americans, when Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia sign a non-aggression pact. The next month, the German blitzkrieg rolls over Poland and World War II begins in earnest. But there is another, even darker side to Karl Haushofer. He has been called Hitler's Merlin, a sinister, shadowy figure immersed in the occult, whose influence would shape the central Nazi doctrines of blood and race. During his time in the Orient, Karl Haushofer, a genius at languages, discovered and translated many of the ancient Tibetan, Hindu, and Buddhist religious texts. Here, he discovered ancient occult beliefs and the Hindu symbols of the Aryan race that Hitler and the Nazis would later adopt.
You have to remember that the carnage and death of the First World War had led many people to doubt Christianity, so that even intellectuals like Karl Haushofer began to look for comfort elsewhere in the old pagan religions of pre-Christian Germany.
Haushofer discovered something else in the East. Western-style political parties did not exist in Asia. Instead, the Japanese created secret societies with ultra-nationalist aims, bound together with oaths and secret rituals. The most important was called the Black Dragons. The Black Dragons were an ultra-nationalist secret society, founded by Ryohei Uchida in 1901. Infiltrating Japanese military, business, and government circles, they used terror, espionage, and bribery to further the expansion of the Japanese empire.
The Black Dragons were probably amongst the most powerful of the secret societies and sects that were operating in Japan at the time. They were financed largely through their control of the Chinese opium trade. And they got their way by a combination of bribes and assassination. Now, the Japanese government didn't mind them. They tolerated them for a number of reasons. One is they were ultra-nationalists. And also, very importantly, they could help further Japan's imperial ambitions.
Like the Nazis, the Black Dragons were motivated by military expansion and ideas of Lebensraum. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea, then the Shandong region of China. From these territories and from Taiwan, the Black Dragons strengthened their influence in China through control of the opium trade. When Manchuria was conquered in 1931, they turned their attention to the rest of China and to Soviet Siberia. In Germany, Karl Haushofer helped create secret societies similar to the Black Dragons. He helped found the Luminous Lodge, whose objective was to explore the origins of the Aryan race. And he was also closely associated with the most important secret society of all, the Thule Society.
The Thule Society was the most important of all the occult secret societies in Germany at the time, because it was very influential with the extreme right-wing nationalist politicians. And the Thule Society, of course, adopted the swastika and the other Aryan symbols long before the Nazis did.
Thule was a legendary island in the far north, similar to Atlantis, supposedly the center of a lost, high-level civilization guarded by ancient, highly intelligent beings who would help to create a race of supermen of Aryan stock to rule the world.
The uncanny parallels between the Thule Society in Germany and Japanese societies like the Black Dragons can only be explained by Haushofer's intimate knowledge of the Japanese secret societies.
As a public front to promote their ideas among Bavarian industrial workers, the Thule Society sets up a group called the Workers' Political Circle, with Thule Society member Karl Harrer as chairman. The Workers' Political Circle grows rapidly until 1920, when it is renamed. The new name is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. An ex-corporal is sent by the Army Secret Service to infiltrate the Nazis. His name is Adolf Hitler. Within a short time, he had become their undisputed leader. Soon, the Nazis were marching openly with the Aryan symbols of the secret Thule Society and its belief in a master race to rule the world. Behind this bizarre spectacle lay Haushofer's belief in the virtues of race, obedience, and selfless courage, epitomized in the warrior traditions of ancient Japan. For over 800 years, the samurai warriors had developed a code of absolute loyalty to the emperor and unhesitating sacrifice. This was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. The cult of Bushido will also inspire the infamous kamikaze suicide attacks at the end of the war. Haushofer formulated a theory that the Bushido warrior's way was very similar to the mystical Teutonic spirit of National Socialism. He saw the Nazi SS stormtroopers as the German samurai.
Haushofer saw the Japanese as the Aryans of the East. And he managed to convince Hitler, the supreme racist, that the Japanese and the Germans could therefore become allies because they shared common Aryan attitudes.
In 1931, Hitler was thrilled by the success of the Japanese invasion of China. The League of Nations did not intervene. Hitler now knew he could tear up the hated Versailles Treaty. In April 1934, a year after Hitler came to power, the Japanese naval attaché in Germany attends a secret meeting with Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess. The meeting takes place in the house of Karl Haushofer in Munich. The outcome will change the history of the 20th century.
That 1934 meeting, 8 years before Pearl Harbor, in Karl Haushofer's house, was the start, really, of the Axis Pact. Rudolf Hess, Haushofer, and the Japanese naval attaché began the process of creating the alliance between Germany and Japan.
In March 1941, the Japanese Foreign Minister Yasuke Matsuoka, a friend and supporter of Karl Haushofer, puts the final peace in place. Matsuoka has already helped negotiate Japan's entry into the Axis Pact. Now he signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin in Moscow. Is this to be the shape of Karl Haushofer's great pan-Eurasian alliance? A superpower with limitless supplies of men and resources, backed by German, Italian, and Japanese technology, and driven by an insatiable lust for conquest? Haushofer was delighted. He wrote his last great book, entitled The Continental Bloc, praising the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Everything was now in place to defeat the Anglo-Saxons. December 7th, 1941. As Japanese planes set out to attack the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, they have detailed information on the location of every ship. The spy who provided this information is watching the attack from his home. He is a German agent recruited by none other than Karl Haushofer. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched their war of conquest with a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet. A total of 423 planes flying from 6 aircraft carriers catch the fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Nearly 200 American aircraft are also destroyed, most of them on the ground. The Japanese have been given detailed information on the fleet's deployment and the location of all major harbor installations, supply dumps, and air bases. This intelligence has come from a German master spy called Bernhard Julius Otto Kuhn.
Kuhn had served as an officer in the Imperial German Navy during the First World War. Like many others, when Germany was defeated, he felt the country had been betrayed, and he very soon joined the Nazi Party.
Kuhn soon became friends with Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's ruthless secret policeman, and with Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief propagandist. He also met Karl Haushofer, who introduced him to the Japanese.
Haushofer's university department at the University of Munich, his Geopolitics Institute, was actually a front for recruiting spies for the German Secret Service. Haushofer handpicked the people he thought could be useful as spies, either for the German diplomatic service or for the Abwehr.
In 1935, Kuhn and his family moved to Honolulu, where Dr. Kuhn pretended to work on a history of the Hawaiian Islands based on Karl Haushofer's theory of geopolitics. Kuhn rented a house that overlooked Pearl Harbor, from which he could survey naval activity through binoculars. Details were passed on to the Japanese consul, Otojiro Okuda. 6 days before the attack, Kuhn visited the Japanese consulate with a map of Pearl Harbor, pinpointing where the main American ships were located. Near dawn, on December 7th, 1941, Bernhard Kuhn stood at the window of his house with a flashlight, ready to signal the Japanese consulate information about the coming attack.
In November 1941, the U.S. military picked up radio signals from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu to Tokyo, explaining that they had a spy in place near Pearl Harbor who was going to use flashlights at night to signal the movement of American aircraft carriers. Bizarrely, the FBI did nothing about it, though they thought the man involved might be Bernhard Kuhn. Well, after Pearl Harbor, of course, Kuhn was arrested, and all the implements of his spying trade were found. Kuhn was put on trial by a secret U.S. military court and sentenced to be shot. Now, when the American government discovered this, they got rather frightened because the military courts had actually no right to try civilians in the United States. And Roosevelt got very worried that if they shot Mr. Kuhn, then there would be retaliation against American civilians being held by the Germans. So in the end, Kuhn was thrown into Fort Leavenworth jail to do hard labor. And at the end of the war, the Americans deported him off to Argentina in 1948. So in fact, he got away with it.
Although Bernard Kuhn was unmasked as an Axis spy, the identities of the other spies and diplomatic contacts recruited by Karl Haushofer and his son Albrecht remain unknown. In 1935, Albrecht visited Britain 6 times, where he made contacts with the British aristocracy. In 1937, he visited America. The two Haushofers continued to maintain links with the Japanese secret societies, in particular the Black Dragons. In 1937, Albrecht also visited Japan. The Black Dragons were highly organized among the overseas Japanese population in Brazil, Peru, and the United States itself. They used bribery and intimidation to spy and secretly acquire strategic materials for the Japanese war effort. As World War II progresses, the beef and food supplies of Latin America become vital to feed the Allied armies. By August 1942, German submarines have sunk 19 Brazilian ships in a bid to cut off such aid. But who was telling the U-boat commanders where to find their prey? In 1942, there were 250,000 Japanese living in Brazil, fertile ground for the Black Dragons. Realizing the methods of Japan's intelligence system, Brazil's authorities were in a quandary. Could the Black Dragons be the source of the information sinking Brazilian ships? As a result of pressure from the United States, Brazil declares war on Germany and Italy. But because of its large Japanese population, Brazil does not declare war on Japan, allowing the Japanese spy network to continue. The Black Dragons are also active in America itself.
There were 120,000 Japanese living on the west coast of the United States. 70,000 of these were American-born, but of these, 10,000 had been sent back to Japan for schooling under the new, fanatical Japanese leadership. Many fear that this group had been infiltrated by the Black Dragons. In Los Angeles in 1940, just before Pearl Harbor, a Korean Japanese infiltrated the Black Dragons and stole documents that claimed to show detailed plans for simultaneous invasions of the Panama Canal Zone, Alaska, California, and Washington State.
In April 1942, President Roosevelt interned all U.S. citizens of Japanese extraction living on the West Coast as a way of containing the influence of the Black Dragons.
The Japanese living on the west coast of the United States were sent to internment camps in the middle of America. Now, today that might seem a panic move, but there were real fears about Black Dragon sabotage. And it also has to be remembered that real Japanese sabotage was discovered in Brazil, so the fears were perhaps not unjustified.
In the murky world of Axis double dealing, however, Karl Haushofer was still to play his strangest card. A card involving his protege, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. On June 22nd, 1941, on the occasion of his 52nd birthday, Adolf Hitler will invade Russia. His hatred of communism and the Slav and Jewish races will triumph over all reason, as well as over Haushofer's cherished plans for a pan-Eurasian alliance.
To Haushofer, whose life had been dedicated to nurturing a Eurasian alliance, Hitler's invasion of Russia was an act of madness. It would hand power to the Anglo-Saxons and lead to the eventual defeat of Germany.
Hitler's Russian adventure was opposed on many levels. There were senior German generals who were privately horrified at the prospect of fighting a war on two fronts. Hitler himself, after the defeat of France, had extended peace feelers to Britain through intermediaries in Spain.
There were some people in Britain, some very, very influential people in Britain, who were sympathetic to a peace settlement. They saw no threat from Germany's territorial ambitions in Europe, and they believed it would be in Britain's long-term interests and the interests of her worldwide empire to secure an agreement with Adolf Hitler and with Germany.
Can a peace deal be brokered with the British before it's too late? Before World War II, Karl Haushofer and his son Albrecht had regular contact with people in Britain who were also influenced by the occult ideas of the ancient Orient. Among these was the Duke of Hamilton and the mysterious Aleister Crowley, a drug addict and a leading member of a mysterious occult society called the Golden Dawn.
Aleister Crowley was a self-confessed mystic and guru of the English upper classes, though I suspect he was much more into drugs and sex than anything spiritual. However, he was very important because he was a link between his contacts in the English aristocracy and the German occult world.
Among those connections was Karl Haushofer, who maintained contacts with the Golden Dawn and may have met Crowley in Germany. In 1941, Karl Haushofer will use his influence with Rudolf Hess to make one last attempt at persuading the Nazis to make peace with the British before Hitler launches his foolish invasion of Russia. On May 3rd, 1941, Hess is visited in secret by Karl and Albrecht Haushofer.
Karl was more famous than Albrecht, but Albrecht was much more brilliant than Karl. And Albrecht was called in by Hess as his personal advisor. He had been a special advisor to Hitler, Ribbentrop, and a personal advisor to Hess. And he was called in by Hess because Hess wanted to know why Britain would not respond to Hitler's peace offers. And Albrecht explained to him that the British regarded Hitler as Satan's representative on earth who had to be fought. And he wrote this down in a document for him. And he explained at length why he thought there was no prospect of peace with Britain, but if he did wish to open up a channel, he explained to him how it should be done.
On May 10th, Hess drives to the Messerschmitt airfield at Augsburg. He asks to borrow a new experimental Messerschmitt Me-110. At 5:42 p.m., Hess takes off, heading north. He will never return. On the 11th of May, 1941, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, flew to Scotland, landing a few miles from the estate of the Duke of Hamilton. His aircraft, an experimental Messerschmitt Me-110, crashed on farmland nearby.
The flight of Rudolf Hess to Britain was an incredible feat. He flew alone, he flew through heavily defended airspace, and he made a pinpoint parachuting into a field very near from the house of the Duke of Hamilton, whom he'd come to visit.
It should be explained that Hess came on the same evening that the House of Commons was bombed. So it could not have been a worse time for a peace mission. But the next morning, that was the 11th of May, my father went through with the interrogating officer, and Hess asked to see him alone. And he said, "I don't know whether you know who I am, but I am Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Germany, and I know Hitler's mind so well, I can tell you exactly what his peace terms are. although this is a personal, unauthorized mission. And he then explained that Hitler wanted to offer Britain a free hand in the empire, provided only that Germany should have a free hand in Europe and the East.
The journey of Rudolf Hess to Britain rocked the world for a few days. He then mysteriously disappeared for 4 years. A shocked Hitler was told the news of Hess's flight. He flew into a rage. He did not want Churchill or Stalin to think that the Nazi leadership was divided or weak. He publicly denounced Hess as a madman. Everyone connected with Hess was now in danger. Winston Churchill had Hess held at a secret location. Surprisingly, no film of Hess in captivity ever appeared in the press, despite its propaganda value. Why did Churchill not put Hess on trial, or make huge propaganda from his arrival?
Churchill was totally opposed to dealing with Hess or making any peace agreement with Hitler. What Churchill wanted to do was to bring the United States into the war and defeat Germany. You must remember that Churchill's mother was an American, and he had an old and close personal relationship with President Roosevelt.
In 1941, Britain stood alone. One by one, she had watched her allies fall under the German jackboot. First Poland, then Norway, France, the Low Countries, and Greece. And for almost a year, she had suffered a relentless pounding from the Luftwaffe. Many people believed that America was the key to Britain's survival. Without American support, she would be defeated. But there were some in Britain who wanted peace with Hitler because they feared America would force Britain to give up its colonial empire as the price of that support. Churchill could not afford to let them near Hess. Even more surprising was that there were some British politicians and military leaders who saw America not as a potential ally, but as an enemy. In 1919, after World War I, the British Royal Navy had even drawn up plans to fight a war with America. And there was one German who knew about these plans, Karl Haushofer. In 1908, Karl Haushofer was on his way from Germany to Japan. Traveling through India, Haushofer met England's most important soldier, Lord Kitchener. And Kitchener told the young Haushofer something he would never forget.
Kitchener prophesied that if Germany and Britain went to war, they would be ruined. And as a result, the United States would become the dominant power in the world. Haushofer began to watch the United States more and more closely. And as the power of the United States grew, he became more and more convinced that Kitchener was correct.
But there was one American who was watching Haushofer and was alarmed by Haushofer's schemes of world domination. He was Father Edmund Walsh, a Jesuit academic and founder of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service.
Father Edmund Walsh was one of the most distinguished Catholic academics in America in the middle of the 20th century. He was very, very influential with a number of American presidents. It's interesting that Walsh decided early on that Haushofer was a dangerous character and went out of his way to try and alert the American government to what Haushofer was preaching in Lebensraum.
In the years before America's entry to the war, Edmund Walsh was a powerful advocate for intervention, arguing the case in Congress and with President Roosevelt. But in the spring of 1941, America is not yet in the war. What Karl and Albrecht Haushofer fear most is that the efforts of Walsh and of Winston Churchill might succeed, and that President Roosevelt will bring America into the war on the side of Britain. If Germany was locked in mortal combat with Russia, American intervention could prove decisive. That is why they persuaded Hess to fly to Scotland, to try to arrange a truce and avert the catastrophic consequences of a grand alliance against Germany. But why Hess? And why contact the Duke of Hamilton?
Karl Haushofer wished to open up a feeler to Britain, and he suggested to Hess that an approach should be made through a neutral country, either to General Sir Ian Hamilton or to the younger Hamilton, by whom he meant the Duke of Hamilton, my father.
On May 12th, only 2 days after Hess had flown to Scotland, mass arrests began in Germany under an operation codenamed Aktion Hess. The detained included the personal staff of Rudolf Hess, but also many others unconnected with him. Who were these people? Adolf Hitler had ordered the roundup of all Germany's leading astrologers. Why?
Rudolf Hess had left a letter for the Führer. Now, its contents have never been discovered, but it's every likelihood that it contained an occult warning about Germany going to its doom if it invaded Russia. Now, to the superstitious Nazis, that would have been a very dangerous thing to get abroad, so Hitler was determined to keep it secret.
Both Karl and Albrecht Haushofer were now questioned by the Gestapo. Albrecht was taken to Hitler's mountain retreat and personally interrogated by Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's deputy.
Well, Hitler knew very well that Hess's great friend had been Karl Haushofer, and also that his son Albrecht, who'd been a special advisor to the Hitler regime, were very much connected with Hess, and he suspected correctly that the Haushofers very much wanted peace with Britain and were totally opposed to a war fought on two fronts.
Slowly, everything Karl Haushofer had come to fear through years of study and preparation now begins to come to pass. As soon as the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declares war against America, confident that far-off America is militarily weak. He is wrong. Churchill's gamble of bringing America into the war has paid off. Hess has been silenced, and America has now joined the Allied powers. Weapons to defeat Hitler and Japan immediately pour from America's factories. Britain quickly becomes an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which to bomb German cities. American warships patrol the Atlantic sea lanes searching for U-boats, and U.S. troops land in the Axis-held territories of North Africa. The Soviet Red Army and Air Force, short on arms, but with men by the million, is equipped with American weapons. With this support, Stalin will launch an offensive against Hitler, leaving America to fight an isolated Japanese empire. The Battle of Stalingrad, November 1942. Here, Hitler will suffer his first major defeat. The city was once a citadel of the Tsars and was known as the gateway to Asia. In a bid to cut Russia's supply lines to the south and break into the Asian steppe, Hitler has committed 500,000 men to capturing the city, the cream of the German armed forces in the east. For 3 months, the gray tide surges through the streets and ruins of Stalingrad. The Russians are driven back to a shallow bridgehead. Then winter comes, and with it a change in the fortunes of war. Soviet attacks unroll on every front. In November, the Axis satellite armies of Italy, Romania, and Hungary are destroyed in a series of massive Red Army offensives. And by the end of January 1943, an entire German army has been swallowed up in the maelstrom. For Italy, it is a mortal blow. And for the Axis alliance, it is the beginning of the end. It seemed that Haushofer's prophecy of doom was coming to pass.
Stalingrad was a catastrophe. Germany lost 20 divisions, more than 250,000 men. It was also a major strategic disaster. Allies began to melt away. A few months after, Italy surrendered. After Stalingrad, there was no real prospect of a German victory.
Albrecht Haushofer now realized that only Hitler's death could save the Germany he and his father had slowly helped to piece together for years. From then on, he began to plot the Führer's assassination. Although the tide had turned on Haushofer's idea of world domination, his sphere of influence continued to resonate in Japan. Using Axis technology, the Japanese were hard at work developing secret weapons years ahead of their time. With them, the outcome of World War II could have been very different, with consequences that can hardly be imagined. In the summer of 1942, while the German army was still advancing in the east, a lone Axis plane flew over Stalingrad. It flew not to Berlin or Rome in the west, but east across Stalin's Russia. For thousands of miles it crossed hostile Soviet territory. Its destination was Japanese Manchuria. The plane was delivering to the Japanese plans of Italian work on jet engines.
Everyone forgets that the Italians were really far advanced in jet technology at the beginning of the war. The Japanese felt if they had that technology, they could create planes that could shoot down the B-29s that were about to arrive. And when the Japanese got that technology, they managed to build aircraft that were even more advanced than the Germans had.
Although most of these planes would never see the light of day, one plane the Japanese actually did develop with the help of the Italian technology flown from Stalingrad was the Oka, or cherry blossom, a rocket-powered manned missile launched from a mother aircraft at U.S. warships. An early but unreliable rocket-powered version was used against American ships in the Pacific, but its slow speed made it vulnerable to being shot down. However, advanced versions of the cherry blossom were under development in 1945. 50 Okas, powered by Italian jet engines, had already been built when the war ended. These were cheap to construct, simple to use, and lethally accurate. As Japan struggled to build its secret jet and rocket planes, Germany was already heading towards defeat. By 1944, the Red Army was rolling back the gray tide of Hitler's legions on all fronts. British and American forces were fighting in Italy, and plans were afoot to land an Allied army on the French coast. Most German officers now realized that the war was lost, and some began conspiring to overthrow Hitler and seek a settlement while they still had a position to bargain from. Among those plotting treason was Albrecht Haushofer, but his father would remain loyal to the very end.
Karl supported his country, whether right or wrong. His patriotism was of an extreme kind, and he would never have acted against his own country. He was very angry with his son Albrecht for having associated with the German resistance to Hitler, because he believed that had imperiled the rest of the family.
Facing defeat, Germany and Japan increasingly turned to the creation of wonder weapons. Planes like the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. Japan also planned to build a version of the Me-262. It was to be called the Karyu, or Fire Dragon.
The Fire Dragon would have flown at 200 miles an hour faster than any American fighter, faster than a Mustang, faster than a Thunderbolt, faster than a Lightning. Nothing would have caught it.
Japan also had a version of the incredible Messerschmitt Me-163. It was called the Shushi, after the death stroke administered by a samurai sword. Powered by a rocket engine, the Shushi could climb in only 2.5 minutes to meet B-29s cruising 5 miles high. It flew at 600 miles an hour and was armed with 2 30mm cannon. Even more advanced Japanese jet projects were spun off from the plans delivered by the Italians. There was the Imperial Navy's Kika, meaning Mandarin orange blossom. Like the Oka, the Kika was designed to attack ships of the expected American invasion fleet. Similar in shape to the successful German Me-262, but smaller, the Kika had folding wings to allow it to be hidden in caves, safe from American bombing. The Navy ordered 200. Most amazing of all was the Kyushu J-7W Shinden interceptor fighter. This was the Japanese Imperial Navy's ultimate reply to the deadly B-29.
The Shinden means magnificent lightning. Many experts have thought that Japanese technology was inferior to the Allies or the Germans, but in this case the Shinden was superior to much that was around at that time.
With its revolutionary rear-mounted swept wings and turbojet, the Shinden was one of the most advanced aircraft projects produced by any country during World War II.
The early jet engines used during the Second World War had a particular problem, which the Japanese, with their typical engineering simplicity, managed to resolve. You see, you need to put a single jet engine in the middle of the plane to maintain the center of gravity. If you do that, the hot gases that exhaust out the end of the jet engine have a bad habit of melting the aircraft unless you have the right metal alloys.
To avoid this problem, early jet engines were hung in pairs, one under each wing, making the plane too heavy. The Shinden overcame this problem by mounting the engine in the tail and reversing the normal aerodynamic configuration, putting the wings at the rear and balancing the plane by putting the control surfaces at the front. This revolutionary shape is called a canard wing. This revolutionary back-to-front wing was test-flown on a glider in 1943. Design of the fighter version was started in earnest in June 1944 as the threat from the first B-29 raids became real. The first prototype, powered by a conventional prop engine, was ready in 10 months. The first test flight was on 3rd August 1945. In combat, the jet version of the Shinden would have been armed with 4 30mm cannon or air-to-air missiles.
In World War II, the Americans lost only 148 B-29s from enemy action. But if the Japanese had managed to deploy aircraft like the Shindens, they'd have lost hundreds more.
The prototype Shindens were discovered by the American Army after Japan's surrender. They were taken to the United States and studied rigorously. The last one can still be found in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. The Japanese found it very difficult to destroy the high-flying U.S. bombers because their planes did not work very well at extreme altitudes. Even when the Americans switched to carpet bombing with napalm at lower altitudes, the Japanese lacked the anti-aircraft guns, radar, and planes to do much damage. But a couple of hundred jet Shindens would have stopped the Americans firebombing Tokyo.
By 1945, Japanese rocket and jet technology was actually in advance of the United States. Had they deployed that technology, they could have met the American forces as equals.
Yet there was one Japanese plane above all others that would have dramatically impacted the course of World War II. Although the Japanese were in the process of developing several planes using highly advanced technology, their most closely kept secret of aviation development was a revolutionary intercontinental bomber designed to hit U.S. cities from bases in Japan. It was called the Nakajima G-10N1 Fugaku, or Mount Fuji, traditional symbol of Japan. The Fugaku was to be powered by 6 Nakajima KK-11 engines, each generating 5,000 horsepower. It was designed to cruise at an altitude of 32,000 feet at a speed of 423 miles per hour. Faster than most U.S. fighters, and it was protected by 4 20-millimeter cannon. Where could Japan get the technology to build large bomber aircraft like the Fugaku? The answer leads back to Karl Haushofer and the Black Dragon Society. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese businessmen, many of them linked to the secret of Black Dragons, operated in the United States. Using funds generated by the opium trade in China, the Japanese purchased American technology, including aircraft, through legal channels. In 1938, the Japanese Imperial Navy used a front company to buy the plans to manufacture the Douglas DC-3 transport.
A Black Dragon front company operating in the United States called the Mitsui Company actually managed to buy the entire plans for the Douglas DC-3 for a mere $90,000.
In 1939, the Japanese legally bought another Douglas transport, the bigger DC-4E prototype. At last, they had access to the most advanced 4-engine, long-range aircraft that America could produce.
From the DC-4 and the DC-4 plans, the Japanese were able to build a prototype long-range bomber called the Shinzan, which actually means mountain valley. It wasn't a terribly good aircraft when they actually got it built. It was underpowered, but it did give them the technology in order to build the Fugaku bomber later on in the war. The Japanese also bought other US aircraft technology, the Lockheed LO, the North American N-16, Seversky fighters, Douglas flying boats. This way, the secrets of US aircraft technology were actually embodied in the Japanese fighting machine that America faced during the Pacific War.
But Japan was not finished. In March of 1939, representatives of the Mitsubishi Company met with executives of Boeing at a plant in Seattle. They discussed buying the plans for the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Failing that, they wanted Boeing to design a Japanese bomber based on B-17 technology. Boeing said it was not possible politically to design the Japanese bomber on company premises, but a hotel or nearby office could be used by the Japanese to produce a joint design. Boeing then said it would need government permission to manufacture. While the Japanese army was considering the issue, World War II broke out and the plan came to nothing.
It was through its commercial contacts that the Japanese were able to build up their bomber technology. In fact, the Fugaku betrays its origins in the DC-4 and even the B-17. But the Japanese had taken this technology a generation forward. They were now building an intercontinental bomber.
The range of the Fugaku was an incredible 9,000 miles. This would have allowed it to attack cities on the American west coast and return safely to the home islands. But so much fuel would have been needed for a return trip. Could the Fugaku have carried a worthwhile bomb load? Here in remote Manchuria, as World War II drew to its close, lay the last great secret of the Axis. A weapon so awesome, it could have saved the Axis from the doom long ago prophesied by the Haushoffers. But as this weapon was being perfected, the Haushoffers would make one last attempt to determine the course of history.
The July 1944 bomb plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler was the most serious attempt to kill him during his entire period as Nazi Führer. And it came closest, but by a bizarre stroke of luck, the bomb was placed on the other side of a table. It was a very strong oak table, and the blast went upwards, killing people around Hitler, but he walked away.
The bomb had been planted by a senior German officer, Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was part of a larger conspiracy to install a civilian government in Germany and seek peace terms with the Allies. Amongst the conspirators was Albrecht Haushofer. Hitler ordered the arrest of everyone remotely connected with the failed coup. Karl Haushofer, who was probably not part of the plot, was also arrested. He was sent to Dachau concentration camp. Albrecht Haushofer escaped to the mountains of his native Bavaria. He avoided capture till the following December, when a chance Gestapo patrol noticed smoke coming from his hayloft hiding place. He was taken to Himmler's Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. Most of the conspirators in the July plot against Hitler's life were hung using piano wire. But not the Haushofers. They remained in prison. Why?
By the end of 1944, Heinrich Himmler realized the war was going to be lost. He decided to keep both the Haushofers alive as negotiating tools with the Americans and the Allies in the West. Essentially, he wanted them to save his own skin.
Although the Japanese concluded Germany was finished, Japan was still militarily strong. She had millions of soldiers in China. She had hoarded thousands of planes to fend off an American invasion. And she had new jet and rocket planes, years ahead of their time, about to go into production.
In order to buy time, the Japanese actually reverted to Haushofer's original plan for a grand Eurasian alliance of Germany, Japan, and Russia itself. First of all, they sent the Berlin ambassador Oshima to speak to Hitler and put this to him. But Hitler, by that time, was in his phase that he was going to go down fighting, so he refused. So then the Emperor Hirohito himself sent a former Japanese Prime Minister, Koki, to speak to the Russians and put to them that Japan and Russia should fight the Americans together.
If Japan could buy time by keeping Russia from attacking her, then she had a better chance of producing the new wonder weapons like the Shinden and the Fugaku. Yet time was running out. On April 30th, 1945, the Russians stormed the Reichstag in Berlin. 7 days later, Nazi Germany surrendered on all fronts, and the search began for the men behind the Reich. But one man they did not find. Before the end came, Hitler had ordered the Gestapo to murder every prisoner. Only hours from liberation, Albrecht Haushofer had been taken from the Moabit prison in Berlin and shot in the back of the head.
Albrecht was shot on 23rd of April 1945 after being promised his freedom with the last remnants of the German resistance to Hitler. And when he was found, he had in his hand the sonnets of Moabit, and one of those sonnets was entitled Guilt. And in it he writes, "I'm not guilty as the judge thinks I'm guilty, but I'm guilty in another way. I spoke my warnings, but my warnings were too feeble. I know today wherein lies my guilt."
Russia finally rejects all of Japan's overtures in July 1945. Japan, last of the Axis powers, is left to fight on alone. But far away from Tokyo and the home islands, in the wild lands of occupied Manchuria, Japan has a secret weapon that could still seize victory from the jaws of defeat. A weapon capable of mass destruction never before seen in history. In the summer of 1945, Japan still occupied China, the Philippines, oil-rich Indonesia, Vietnam, and Korea. The bulk of her army and air force was still intact. Many in Asia saw her as a fighter against the return of white colonialism. Invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied dead. Japan was by no means defeated. And she still had an ace to play. Deep in Manchuria, Japan had developed a weapon of mass destruction no other nation yet possessed. A weapon she could use to attack the continental United States. This weapon had been created by Unit 731, the brainchild of soldier-scientist General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was born in 1892 in the village of Kamo, east of Tokyo. The son of a rich feudal landowner, Ishii studied medicine and became interested in bacteriology. A fierce nationalist, he joined the army upon graduating. In April 1928, Ishii left on a 2-year research trip, visiting 30 countries. In particular, he visited Germany to study the German army's use of poison gas during the First World War. More than likely, the introduction Shiro Ishii had to the secretive German military in this period came from contacts established by Karl Haushofer. On his return to Japan, Ishii convinced the Japanese Army High Command to begin a vast research program into a form of warfare even more terrible than the use of gas: germ warfare. Ishii was promoted to major and put in charge of the project. In size and scale, it would come to rival America's atomic bomb project. In 1931, the Japanese attacked and stole the vast country of Manchuria from China. Manchuria became the base for the operations of the Black Dragon Society.
The Black Dragons financed much of industry and business in Manchuria with money laundered from their control of the Chinese opium trade. It was an ideal place to build a biological warfare facility. It was remote. It was controlled by an unholy alliance of the Black Dragons and the military. Secrecy was guaranteed.
In 1938, work began on a vast research complex at Pingfang. It covered 3 square kilometers and took 2 years to build. So secret was the base that Japanese military planes were banned from flying over it. Here, Ishii set about building his biological weapons.
The purpose of their experiments was to find out which particular diseases were the most virulent when it came to military use. They tried everything, but in fact it transpired that good old-fashioned medieval bubonic plague was the worst possible disease. Just as well they were doing the experiments in remote Manchuria, because in the end Ishii managed to stockpile enough bubonic plague to wipe out the entire human race.
In bombing experiments, Ishii discovered that the fragile germ microbes perished because of strong air pressure or high temperature. What would make Shiro Ishii infamous was his solution to the delivery problem. Outside the human body, the bubonic plague germ dies, but it can be carried by the humble flea. One flea bite can transfer 24,000 plague microbes to a human being. But how do you deliver fleas? Traditional bombing methods would surely kill the fleas in the blast. After years of intensive development, Ishii made a breakthrough. What if the casing of the bomb was made of clay? It would require less charge to explode the bomb, preserving the plague-carrying fleas to spread out with their cargo of death. In 1944, fully a year ahead of the first secret American atomic bomb test, Ishii developed his first germ bomb. Would it work? It is the world's first smart weapon. The bomb splits into two parts. A porcelain container is slowed by a parachute. This is filled with 30,000 plague-carrying fleas and oxygen to keep them alive. A radio beacon falls to Earth first, and on contact with the ground, detonates the germ bomb at the most lethally effective altitude.
The tests proved that 80% of the bacteria carrying fleas actually survived explosions. So Ishii now knew he had a weapon, and pretty soon he was turning out plague bombs, anthrax bombs, typhoid bombs. The thing he really had to do, though, was to prove that they killed people, and this is the most appalling part of his experiments beyond the technology. He experimented on live people to prove that the weapons worked. He used Chinese peasants, captured Chinese soldiers, and in particular he used captured Allied airmen.
In the autumn of 1941, Prime Minister Tojo personally awarded Shiro Ishii with a medal for successfully attacking the Chinese army with plague at the important communications center at Changte. On April 18, 1942, the United States took revenge for Pearl Harbor. The carrier Hornet launched 16 B-25 bombers for the first American attack on Japanese soil, led by Colonel James Doolittle. The targets were Tokyo, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka. Damage was light. 90 buildings were destroyed and 90 Japanese killed. But Japanese pride was outraged.
The Japanese initially retaliated by attacking those parts of China, the Zhejiang region, where Doolittle's bombers had landed. But this was just the prelude to a more sinister plot which Hiroishi had sought out. The Japanese would pretend to retreat. The Chinese would then probably advance. But the Japanese would cede the ground over which the Chinese would advance with deadly biological weapons.
Detachments of biological warfare teams from Unit 731 contaminate reservoirs, rivers, and wells with germs of cholera, dysentery, typhoid, plague, and anthrax. Then the trap is sprung. Approximately 250,000 Chinese troops and civilians died in the revenge attacks following the Doolittle raid. Large numbers died as a result of germ warfare. But by using natural diseases, the Japanese were able to hide the true numbers. Was this the deadly cargo the six-engine Fugaku would have carried across the Pacific to America?
The Japanese expended considerable efforts on developing methods of attacking the continental United States by submarine, by aircraft, by balloon. There is no doubt they could have delivered Ishii's biological weapons had they chosen, and if they had done, then perhaps hundreds of thousands of Americans would have been killed.
In the summer of 1945, Unit 731 embarks on its most dangerous operation yet. codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night. The intention is to use the Japanese Navy's new I-400 submarine aircraft carriers. The target date is September 22nd, 1945. The plan is to bomb San Diego with bubonic plague bombs manufactured in Unit 731.
The Japanese Army's project for using biological weapons against the United States was called Cherry Blossoms at Night. Unfortunately, the Japanese Army didn't have a delivery system ready. The Fugaku bomber was not flying yet. The alternative method for delivering these weapons was to use the Japanese Navy's secret aircraft carrier submarines, the giant I-400s. The Japanese Army and Japanese Navy then fell out over how to use these submarines, because the Navy wanted to keep them in reserve to use for kamikaze attacks against attacking American aircraft carriers.
Fortunately for San Diego, the Japanese Navy refused to endanger their I-400s in a last-ditch attack on the United States.
Perhaps if the Japanese had publicly threatened to use their biological weapons against the United States, this would have deterred America from using its atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
By 1945, the Pingfan germ warfare factory was mass-producing bio-bombs. Japan was also working on nuclear weapons. By 1939, experiments in Europe had already proven that nuclear fission was possible, and that the likely best material to use was uranium. The Black Dragon industrial empire in Korea and Manchuria also gave Japan access to uranium oxides.
Manchuria is rich in all kinds of minerals, and a leading member of the Black Dragons called Kodama Yoshi was recruited to supply these minerals to Japan's war factories. Kodama ended up making a fortune.
An American atomic bomb finally ended World War II. While the Allies rushed ahead with the Manhattan Project, the Japanese had already decided by 1943 that an atomic bomb was theoretically possible. However, perhaps because they were so far ahead in biological warfare, they decided that nuclear weapons would take too long to develop. Nuclear research remained a low priority. But why did the Japanese never use their secret bioweapons?
After Hiroshima, senior Japanese military like Ishii realized the war was lost. Rather than use the biological weapons, Ishii decided that he could trade their secrets to the Americans for immunity. So Ishii and the staff at Unit 731 escaped prosecution after the war. In fact, Ishii himself became a senior advisor to the United States military on biological and chemical weapons.
On April 7, 1987, the Japanese government at last admitted the existence of Unit 731. It also admitted that Shiro Ishii, godfather of Japan's biological warfare project, had been paid a retirement pension for his work. He died on the 9th of October, 1959, age 67. Yet Shiro Ishii's biological plagues did not die. Even 60 years later, Ishii's enhanced varieties of bubonic plague continue to ravage parts of China. Today, the relatives of the victims of these attacks are still trying to claim compensation from Japanese courts. Meanwhile, in Europe, when the inevitable result of the Nazi plans for an Aryan super race are discovered, the leading Nazis like Rudolf Hess and Karl Haushofer are called to account. In 1946, the Allies put the Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg. Among those in the dock was Rudolf Hess. He was brought back from prison in England and put on trial for his life, and for one last reunion with Karl Haushofer. Karl Haushofer was liberated from a Nazi concentration camp in 1945, but he did not slip away unnoticed. Hitler's Merlin, the brains behind Mein Kampf, and the architect of the Axis Pact, was brought to Nuremberg to confront Hess by none other than his old adversary, Father Edmund Walsh.
After the war, the Reverend Edmund Walsh saw Karl Haushofer on behalf of the American Armed Services. And the Reverend Edmund Walsh decided he should not be prosecuted for war crimes on the grounds that his advice had been advisory and intellectual, and that he should not be prosecuted. But he did take Haushofer to Nuremberg, and Haushofer was appalled to see the destruction of the whole city. And when he was taken to see Hess, Hess refused to recognize him, claiming amnesia, that he couldn't remember.
The British later admitted that they had used mind-bending drugs, truth drugs, on Hess to try and get information out of him. It could well be that they affected his mental and physical stability. However, the Allies did think that Hess was bluffing, so they brought his old friend Karl Haushofer to see him, to see if that would jog his memory. Haushofer told Hess about the family, he explained about Hess's wife and son, but Hess still claimed he couldn't remember Haushofer or anybody.
Bluffing or not, Hess was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. From the dock, he made an extraordinary speech. "I am happy to know that I have done my duty to my people. My duty as a German, as a National Socialist, and as a true disciple of the Führer. I regret nothing." Rudolf Hess, once Hitler's deputy, the student and protege of Karl Haushofer, spent the next 47 years in Spandau prison, the last 21 of them in solitary confinement. Other prominent Nazis like Albert Speer, who was the organizer of mass slave labor in the Reich, were eventually allowed their freedom. Why were the Allies so anxious to keep Rudolf Hess isolated in prison? Only since the death of Hess have new facts emerged that did not come out at the Nuremberg trials.
Winston Churchill knew that Rudolf Hess was coming to Britain, and he laid a trap for him. Alistair Crowley, the British occultist, had been recruited by the Secret Service. In fact, his controller was Ian Fleming, who later created the James Bond spy novels. Now, Fleming got Crowley to invent spurious occult predictions about Germany being taken to its doom by Adolf Hitler, and these were used to demoralize Hess and other Nazis.
Rudolf Hess, the last Nazi, was found mysteriously strangled to death in Spandau prison in August 1987. His gravestone reads, "I took the risk." Other senior Nazis found guilty at the Nuremberg trials were either hung or sentenced to long terms in prison. Haushofer's friend, the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, was hanged. And Hermann Göring, who succeeded Hess as deputy Führer, committed suicide. What happened to Karl Haushofer? In 1946, age 75, Karl Haushofer and his wife committed suicide. His wife took poison, but he took his own life in the traditional Japanese fashion, disemboweling himself with a sharp samurai short sword in the ceremony called seppuku.
When Karl Haushofer returned on the Ides of March, he and his wife Martha committed suicide, and he left instructions behind that no marker should go on his grave.
Throughout the Eurasian landmass, the end result of Karl Haushofer's theories of geopolitics and Lebensraum was destruction and carnage on a scale never before seen in history. The right of strong nations to conquer and exploit the lands of their weaker neighbors, combined with spurious doctrines of racial superiority, had eventually culminated in mass murder and genocide. Yet, in Japan today, Karl Haushofer's influence continues to live on. The Black Dragons, the mysterious organization which played so heavily in his plans for German domination, still exist. They became the famous Japanese organized crime syndicate known as the Yakuza.
The Yakuza are the Japanese equivalent of the Mafia. The name Yakuza means 893, the losing numbers in the Japanese version of blackjack. After World War II, Kodama, who made millions in Manchuria, set up prostitution rackets and took over labor unions. He was eventually caught taking a $2 million bribe from Lockheed to ensure the Japanese government bought its planes.
Whatever ideals the Black Dragons might once have had perished with the Axis and Japan's plans for imperial conquest. But history might have been different, and the strange alliance between the Black Dragons and Karl Haushofer could well have brought about an Axis victory. There might have been a day when Fugaku bombers headed across the Pacific towards San Francisco, armed with deadly biological weapons.
When Adolf Hitler rejected Karl Haushofer's advice, he opened the way to Lord Kitchener's prophecy coming true, and America becoming a world power, indeed the only world power today. If Haushofer had had his way, the Axis would have won, and America today would probably be a German colony.
Had Haushofer's plans ever come to fruition, Axis warplanes like the remarkable Fugaku might have carried the virus of Lebensraum to America. Fortunately, America escaped the fate of Europe and Japan. The Axis powers